This video is on chapter 31, the derivatives of the trigonometric functions. And so you look at theorem 250, you look at theorem 250. Theorem 250 gives you all the formulas for the derivatives of the trigonometric functions. What I'm going to do in this video is explain where those formulas come from. So basically I'm going to prove the theorem. So the first part is the derivative of sine is equal to cosine. How do we have that? Well, we use the definition of derivative. We use the limit as h goes to 0 of your function x plus h minus f of x divided by h. So we have sine of x plus h minus sine of x divided by h. Then we apply a trig identity here. So we have sine x cosine h plus cosine x sine h. So just use a trig identity. Then we break this up algebraically. I didn't put in all the steps because I wanted to save some board space here. But we group things together. We take the sine x cosine h and the negative sine x, and we put those together and factor out the sine x. So we factor the sine x out of this term and this term, and we have cosine h minus 1. That's where this comes from. And then we looked at our limit theorems. We know that the limit as h goes to 0 of cosine h minus 1 divided by h is equal to 0. And as h goes to 0, sine x is constant. So this term goes to 0, so this limit is 0 times sine x, which is 0. The limit as h goes to 0 of sine of h divided by h is 1. And again, cosine x is constant as far as h is concerned. So this limit goes to cosine of x times 1. So the derivative of sine is cosine. There are different ways to do this. If we wanted to calculate the derivative of cosine, we could have used the definition and just had cosine of x plus h minus cosine of x divided by h and used the trig identity. I did this a different way. I used another trig identity. The fact that cosine of x is sine of x plus pi over 2. So if we're going to take the derivative of cosine, that's the same as taking the derivative of sine of x plus pi over 2. Then we use the chain rule, because we already know the derivative of sine is cosine. So we have cosine of x plus pi over 2. The chain rule says multiply by the derivative of the inside function. So the derivative of x plus pi over 2 is 1. So we use the chain rule. Now we use another trig identity. Cosine of x plus pi over 2 is cosine of x times cosine of pi over 2 minus sine of x times sine of pi over 2. Sine of pi over 2 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So this simplifies nicely to negative 1 times sine x. So we have the derivatives of sine and cosine. The other four trig functions can be written in terms of sine and cosine, so we can just use the quotient rule to calculate those derivatives. Since tangent of x is the sine of x divided by cosine of x, we know the derivative of sine is cosine. We know the derivative of cosine is negative sine. Now use the quotient rule. The same thing for cotangent. Secant is 1 divided by cosine. You could use the quotient rule, or the fact that 1 divided by cosine is cosine of x to the negative 1, and then use the chain rule. So you can use the quotient rule or the chain rule for secant and for cosecant.